Morning from sunny downtown Denver, and welcome back, or welcome to, the Creative Vitality Summit. We're so pleased that you could join us today. Thanks to the folks in the room, thanks to the folks online. Extra thanks to West Staff for bringing all of us here together today. It's a privilege to share the dais with all of these brilliant people who you're going to hear from momentarily. My name is Randy Engstrom. I had the incredible fortune of being a co-designer on this project. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we get to have with all of you today, where we'll be discussing the idea of civic imagination. Today, we're going to explore civic imagination as the intersection of the civic body, which is policy, governance, and the public realm, and creative practice, how we imagine our stories together through sound, music, images, and design. Following a global pandemic, a racial justice reckoning, a climate crisis, and growing economic inequality, the urgency for policy solutions and the role that arts and culture play in our communities has been transformed dramatically. How can our communities foster networks of care and belonging? How can we advance civic infrastructure towards justice? What is the role of narrative and imagination in addressing our civic traumas? And where can we see evidence of work happening on the ground that can amplify civic imagination and better futures? First, I want to take a moment just to acknowledge the folks who helped me on my journey in this idea: Roberto Bedoya, Tom DeCaney, Danielle Brazel, Mark Folk. Love you all. And I want to lift up something that one of our other co-designers, Cezanne Charles, said yesterday, which is that under-imagined futures have consequences. And the consequence of under-imagined futures, of not leaning into our civic imagination, is being trapped in the false binaries that create the conditions of economic inequality, racial injustice, and climate catastrophe. We're going to look at themes today like curiosity versus comfort. If our public institutions tend towards comfort and safety, how might we orient ourselves towards curiosity and possibility? How might we challenge the false binaries of good, evil, right, left, tall buildings, single-family housing, bike lanes, parking? We live in a world of false binaries where we're trapped and forced to make a choice between two things, when in fact the world is more complex and nuanced and allows for far more possibility. And how might we support risk-taking across a number of sectors that don't tend to foster that trait? In general, philanthropy and government and nonprofits tend to avoid risk-taking, tend towards risk aversion. And so today we're going to challenge that with some folks on this panel who are doing that work at many different levels of the sector and of the country. And I'm so pleased to be with all of them here today. We're going to start with some introductions. I'll go first and we'll go down the line. My name is Randy Engstrom. I use he, him pronouns. I am a white male with brown hair, salt and pepper beard, and glasses. I am, unsurprisingly, wearing a vest and a tie. I am the co-founder and principal of a collaborative consulting studio based in Seattle, Washington, called Third Way Creative, that works at the intersection of cultural policy, racial equity, and the creative economy. Seattle is home, the ancestral home and future lands of the Coast Salish people, the Duwamish and the Muckleshoot in particular. And what brings me here today with these folks, and I'll pass it to my friend Salvador here to my right.
Good morning. Thank you. It's an honor to be here present in this summit. My name is Salvador Ruiz Esquivel. I'm the executive director and co-founder of Moving Arts Española, an out-of-town, out-of-school program where we serve children and youth 3 to up to 25. We are based in Oquewingo Pueblo, Tehualam, formerly known as San Juan Pueblo. We live in a vast community where there's a lot of need, a lot of with regard to the arts, a lot of places where we offer belonging to the children and youth in the facility. I'm originally from Guadalajara, Jalisco, Mexico, and I'm proud to be representing this day Moving Arts Española, and interested in finding out more about a little bit. I apologize. I get stage fright.
Good. We got your back.
Yeah.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Alberto Mejia. My pronouns are he, him. I am a light-skinned Chicano Latino male. I have long hair that's black and curly or dark brown and a beard. And I'm wearing a sort of aquamarine shirt today. I'm here representing the National Association of Latino Arts and Cultures, which is based in San Antonio, Texas, aka the lands of Yanaguana. I myself reside in Austin, Texas, the homelands of the Lipan Apache, Tonkawas, and Coahuiltecan peoples. The role of NALAC is to sustain, develop, and elevate Latinx arts and cultures throughout the United States, including Puerto Rico, and also with some cross-border collaborations in Mexico and Central America. We accomplished that work through re-granting, grant making. We accomplished that work through developing leaders in the arts and arts organizations. We accomplished that also through research into the sector and the impact of the sector. And we also do that through advocacy with decision makers and communities throughout the United States. So it's a pleasure to be here today. And I would say I'm called here today in the spirit of community and conviviality with my fellow cultural workers and leaders here. I'm really inspired. I really get filled up and restored and feel it's a good time to check our praxis, our integrity, and how we're moving in the respective work that we do. And I really thank West Staff because I think that's the culture that West Staff sets for us here, to come together, really exchange beautiful theory, talk about the actions, and then talk about the reflection upon those actions, the refinement, and the repeating of that cycle as we work in community. So I'll pass it on to my colleague, Jessica.
Thanks, Alberto. I'm Jessica Stern, Senior Manager for Local Arts and Business Partnerships at Americans for the Arts. Thank you to West Staff for having me, and thank you, Randy, for moderating this panel. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm visiting today from the past, present, and future lands of the Tiwa, Ute, Icari Apache, and Comanche peoples, which is also known as Taos, New Mexico. Happy to have a fellow New Mexican representing here. For a visual description, I am a white woman with blonde shoulder-length hair and blue eyes. I'm wearing kind of a black and floral dress with a black leather jacket. At Americans for the Arts, my role is to create educational programming and communications and resources that support local arts agency leaders across the country in their efforts to build mutually beneficial relationships with business leaders, business networks such as chambers of commerce, economic developers, and to be leaders alongside those partners in creating the conditions for arts and culture and the creative economy to be a necessary and a viable solution for equitable economic development in our communities. I also have the privilege of leading the organization's inclusive creative economy work, which has been established alongside many of the leaders in this room and I'm sure online. That work is designed to support local practice around cultural asset mapping and identification for means of policy change and practice change for the redistribution of resources. I'm really excited today to be in this conversation because the work that I do is entirely about imagining a different narrative, a different, more centralized and respected, understood, and connected role for arts, culture, and the creative economy, and then working to build the trusting relationships that are needed in order to create policy change and practice change. So I'm really excited to be in this conversation with my colleagues.
Thank you. Good morning and good afternoon for those who are on the East Coast. It's great to be here, and I want to also thank West Staff for the invitation. Excited to be on the panel with these great folks. Also excited to be in Denver and see snow. I'm originally from Chicago, and it's nice to just see a little snow. My name is Michael Orlov. I use he, him pronouns. I am at the National Endowment for the Arts. I am the Director of Regional, State, and Local Partnerships, and also the international activities. I live on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway and Pamunkey peoples, also known as Washington, D.C. And what else can I tell you? I think that's good enough. I'm also just excited to be part of this conversation, both in person and online, and look forward to what happens over the course of the day. Back to you, Randy.
Thank you. Thank you all. Really excited to be in this collaboration. We developed a number of questions. I'll direct the question to an individual person first, but many of them will chime in to answer. These were all sort of developed together. But we're going to start, Alberto, with a question for you. You know, we've talked about the challenges of the contemporary civic imaginary being a little bit limited by scarcity thinking, by sort of false binaries, being trapped in sort of a mindset of limitation.
Mm-hmm.
And how can we identify both gaps and opportunities to advance new models, new imaginaries, new possibilities for how our communities can exist?
Thank you, Randy. I think, you know, when we talked about this question before we started talking, what came to mind that is that it's time, you know, for folks, especially involved in the work, but also I think audiences and people that care about arts and culture and the creative cultural economy, it's time to flex our radical imaginations a bit. I think it's also important to sort of expand our notions of what the creative economy looks like and who's included and who's not, thinking in terms of big C culture. I think that it's also a time, you know, especially after the pandemic, where we kind of take a moment to reflect and on our positions, or maybe what's known as our positionality. So wherever we find ourselves working, whether it's an individual artist or within a municipal arts government, in an arts service organization such as myself, you know, we each have ways that we can sort of move toward solutions that will, you know, engender a more inclusive creative economy. And I think that includes, you know, thinking about where culture is produced. We were talking earlier about, you know, us in the NALAC, on Team NALAC, when we were engaged in relief funding during the pandemic, like a lot of arts service organizations were, and that was in collaboration with the ELE partners, which includes the PIE Foundation, First Peoples Fund, SIP Culture, First Alaskans Institute, International Association of Blacks in Dance, and I think also Alternate Roots. When we were called to do that, we received funds to redistribute, and in the act of having to get funds rapidly out to the community, I think we can safely say we reached a lot of artists that were not of the grant-seeking kind. Artists and organizations in new places, and also I don't think that perceived themselves in a way of worthy of institutional support. But the moment that we were in, people, some of our barriers and assumptions were dropped on the institutional side and the community side, and they came into our fold, and we had these incredible stories of people in places that we, you know, previously had hoped to reach. And I think what I'm getting at here is having those folks receive clear messages from folks on the grant-seeking side or on the government side that they also count and are included in the creative economy. I'm talking about people that are, you know, immigrants with or without documentation, that are driving Ubers, that are working in the gig economy, caretakers of parents. Are they being told and sent the clear messages that they are artists, they are creatives, as much as someone who has, you know, had the privilege and exposure and training to, you know, be connected into institutions like the ones that we're in? So I think that's going to take a lot of creativity from folks that sit in the positions that we sit in. We have to stop, you know, we have to start thinking creatively and engage in field building. You know, if you're an NGO side, public, or maybe you find yourself in the private sector, you know, doing corporate social responsibility, or if you're in an ERG group that's, you know, for BIPOC folks within a tech corporation, there's a lot of connections that can be made. And I think a mentor of mine, Maribel Alvarez, talked about when you are moving with your positionality and not just necessarily an ideology or a brand, and working, it's kind of an easy reduction to say work across the aisle, work with people differently. But thinking about your positionality and what goal you share in common with people in unlike situations from yours, you know, I think you can advance and create new structures that are more inclusive. You know, thinking even as on the granular level of building arts organizations, building relationships and understanding how CDFIs do or do not finance people, for investments. I worked with the city of Austin also recently in leveraging dollars to get out relief dollars, PPP and whatnot. And it was interesting to see that the CDFIs were much more nimble in getting resources rapidly out than some of the banks, right? At that time, we were all kind of involved in our respective ways. But unfortunately, some of the folks that we were targeting, working with gigging artists, individual artists, and then artists that didn't have fiscal sponsorship or a fiscal status, they couldn't make the cut. And these are the people that are literally the base of the economy in a place like Austin. So I think we really need to think creatively and beyond sort of brand and ideology. Because if you're moving with your values, you're going to be challenged. You're going to find people with different ways that are trying to advance the creative economy than you. And I think that anything that's a red flag to me is when people say, this is the only way, I think that is not the thinking that will help us create the future that we're trying to imagine. And so I would also say to leaders, when you have folks that are coming from a different place or listening to younger emerging leaders about their ideas, with all respect to the time given, the experience, and honestly the trauma of some of our leaders in the work, the younger generation has a lot of creativity. They have a lot of experience with technology and how to advance the mission in different ways, even if they feel uncomfortable. Getting locked into one way of achieving the goal, I think is a way that it is not going to be the solution for the times that we're in. Sorry if I went on too long.
No, it's great. Mr.
Can I?
Owen. Yeah.
Yeah. And I realize, I apologize, I did not do a visual description, which is not why I'm raising my hand now, but I will say I'm a white male, middle-aged white male with a unfortunately receding hairline, very quickly receding hairline, wearing a blue blazer and a white button-down shirt. You started your response with flexing radical imagination, and it almost fits perfectly with what Cezanne said yesterday, and I wrote it down just now. Under-imagined futures have consequences. And for me, as you said that, and listening to what Cezanne said, I think being a parent of two kids, and my wife is a school teacher, we talk about imagination for, K through 12. That's all we talk about is imagination. And you need to be imaginative. You need to flex your radical imagination. And what happens when we get into the workforce? Mm-hmm. It's almost as if we go backwards. And it's like, we don't want any imagination. We don't want anyone to think creatively. It's, as you said, let's just do what we've been doing the whole time. And so I feel, and it's maybe just more of a prompt back to the panel, we were given a very strange gift of not the pandemic, obviously, but this ability to reimagine how we do everything, how we work, mm-hmm. how we process grants, how we actually function as a society. And I just wanted to call that out in terms of what you said at the beginning and what Cezanne said yesterday really fit well together.
I'd love to add, I think it's really important that we thinking about new imaginaries, to understand why and how and where arts and culture sits currently, because of a predominantly white-centric, Eurocentric culture that separates the arts. In that cultural tradition, you have an audience in one place and artists and artisans and performers in another place, and it's very separate. This is not rooted across mm-hmm. all cultures and all humanity, but it is in Eurocentric cultures. And so it's, given the dominance of that in our business and economic systems and in politics, it's no wonder that arts and culture sits so entirely separately. And if we think about, when I talk to economic developers, they all know the intrinsic value of the arts. They know that the arts make for great places to live and to work, but the chasm between incorporating arts, culture, and artists and the creative economy into those economic development plans and systems is massive, because they still think about it as this nice to have or this thing that I do after my work hours, because we've been told to put our imaginations, to stop playing, to stop being curious, to put that aside so that we can be productive citizens of the economy. And so I think when we talk about radical imagination, we need to play more. We need to think more about bringing that creative side of ourselves into our business work.
I agree.
I think something that I would like to add with regard of imagining, I think something that we all need to be aware of is that when we do our work, especially in the arts, we need to take risks. And the way we take risks is when we look at the community, when we look at the needs that the community has, is where you need to risk, okay, this is what I'm going to do. You know, one way or another, I'm gonna do it without minding what people will say or what roadblocks are you gonna have, especially economic roadblocks that many small organizations go through. But if you don't take the risk with what you are imagining, with what you are thinking, you're never going to be able to do it. And I'm proud to say that is one of the ways our program was built up, because we saw the need and we took the risk in a small community where we are. And thankfully, we've been getting an incredible support for the community. Why? Because we took the risk, they saw the need, and here we are.
Yes. May I say one more thing?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I'm just really called to think about, thinking technically about when we were leveraging relief grants or even some of our core grant programs that might be place-based or designed to sort of, interrupt a system of or symptom of, racial injustice at Nala. But in doing that work and trying to achieve it, coming out of the pandemic, we learned even more about how, if you want to resource, for example, a disabled artist, and you have a good intent of giving them, let's say, a large fellowship, that can also disrupt their social service benefits, right? So we did some learning and thinking around that, and with the support of Ford Foundation, we kind of started to integrate those practices to be a part of how we re-grant, how we see people, sending a clear signal that they are also included in our efforts. Thinking about Black folks, Indigenous folks, disabled folks, like sending. But the thing is that it takes time, And I thought about how there's been, I think, with good reason, a lot of, meme culture and I think discussions in culture about the sacredness and importance of rest, or at least moments to reflect. Like, I think you talk about taking a risk. I think there are leaders in our work that have been at it for so long, working so hard, that they think the risk of not executing for even a month, a quarter, or a year would potentially collapse things. However, I think that, I've seen some leaders in philanthropy say, we're not going to make grants for a year. We're going to focus on our team. Is our team okay after the losses that we've experienced, the collective trauma we've been in? Is our pay scales okay? Are we setting the right, is the paperwork process for people to access our resources inclusive? How can you do that when you're just in execution mode over and over again? And so that, I think, is interesting. Like, it's almost like some people think it's a risk to rest in our creative economy, and the folks that are holding leadership. Yep. To do those, and isn't it better to maybe pause for 6 months or a year to come back and with no hesitance be able to say, we're serving people at an advanced and deeper new level? Isn't that a better reward than potentially executing and then, while the train is moving, trying to make sure that the train is inclusive and has room for everybody?
I'd love to connect that to another thing that we were going to talk about. I was going to ask you about, Salvador. You're talking about leadership, how we sustain leadership. Shout out to Rest. Look up the NAP ministry. There's a lot that we've had a lot of conversations while we've been fortunate to be here in Denver about self-care and about the importance of individual relationships and connection. That is the foundation of trust, and it is with trust that you can actually do systemic change work. But I wanted to go back to this notion of leadership, and something that I think our field struggles with is the cultivation of leadership over generations, being intentional with leadership transitions, and how we cultivate a next generation of leadership. That's obviously a huge focus of your organization, Salvador.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about the opportunities that you see in the cultivation of emerging leadership and next generations of leadership?
The way I see it, and what we're seeing right now, especially in our program, being the co-founder and the director for 15 years, as long as the program has, I'm not going to live forever. And what we need to do is take a look and cultivate these young people, these young artists that are all around, whether regardless of their art direction that they're taking. What do they need? We need to support them. We need to guide them on the right direction, I think not the right direction, on a path that is suitable for them. Again, we don't want to tell them this is the way you have to do it. But to be able to accomplish many of those things, something that we've been talking about is funding. It's assistance, especially, again, going back to small organizations where, yes, there are organizations like ours that has been a small organization, but we are in the process of exploding, moving up to helping to supporting the young adults, which there will be the next leaders. As a big example, we have a couple of young 20-something, late 20s that are my right hand and my left hand in the program. And what are we doing? We're giving them the support. We're trying to guide them, to show them the ropes of what it takes to lead a nonprofit organization, in my case. But the needs are there. They're hungry for learning. But when you have those roadblocks of the granting and to be able to hit the right grant, the right organization that is going to be able to help you to keep doing the work that we're doing. It's one of the things that are desperately needed. And we're doing it. We do it by need. We do it by necessity. We do it by what we see in the community, and is what we're trying to get young people from the community to lead their own community, by give them a voice and a belonging in the program.
Go ahead, Michael.
I just wanted to add, and it goes back to something that was being said before, or I think it was Alberto talking about rest, but we also don't really focus on learning, like actual learning on the job, learning from mistakes, learning from experiences.
Exactly.
I think there's this expectation that, especially as folks that are centered in their work, that are not next gen, that you just don't make mistakes. You just, everything you have to do is perfect and flawless, right? And so I wanted to add learning to rest. What are we learning, not just from the pandemic, but on a day-to-day basis? But with regards to next gen professional development, I feel like not necessarily has been thrown out the window, but it almost feels like it's a burden for organizations to provide that. I can speak of my own experience, both at the National Endowment for the Arts, but also when I worked for the city of Chicago. There needs to be a much more robust offering of professional development opportunities for folks, not just at the next gen, but in mid-career. I know I've benefited. One of the reasons I want to be here, this is professional development. I get to learn from folks in the room. So professional development for me is so important, and it should be a part of every your, whatever it's called in each organization, your work doc, right? It should be part of every 6 months. You're talking about how are you learning, not just from the day-to-day work, but how are you learning from the field, from your colleagues? So it's just something I wanted to add.
No, I so appreciate that. And I'm glad you brought up your experience back in Chicago, because I think one thing we struggle with is how practice happens on the ground. We do programs, we build relationships, one-to-one relationships in our home communities. All politics is local. But in order to affect systems change, in order to affect change at scale, we need to affect policy, which tends to be far from the ground. And Michael, I'll start this question with you. And it's not so much how can you from the NEA connect programs to policy, although I think that Dr. Rosario Jackson, who is amazing, shout out to Dr. Rosario Jackson, the way she talks about civic cultural infrastructure is very resonant with me, the civic imagination conversation and the role that arts plays. But I think that we've come up a number of times on the panel. Speaking of learning, the pandemic taught us a lot of stuff. It taught us how fast we can move. It taught us how quickly we can move to remote work. It taught us how easy it is to go back to the status quo. It taught us how easy it is to transform. What do you think the pandemic taught us, and what can that tell us about the possibility for structural change at a policy level?
Well, that was about 18 questions wrapped up
Pick the one you want to answer.
into one.
I had to evolve from the question I said I was going to ask you to the question I decided to ask you. So
that's
long runway.
I appreciate it. First, because you acknowledged our chair, Maria Rosario Jackson, we're blessed to not only have somebody who comes with such incredible experience as an urban planner, as an academic, as somebody who really comes from the field, but who has such an open mind to change, to innovation, to learning. So I've been really fortunate to not only work with her now as her being the chair, but she was also on our council for 8+ years. I've already forgotten all the prompts that you laid out. What have we learned?
What did we learn?
Well, we've certainly learned how screwed up things have been over the course of time. I mean, it took a pandemic to understand all the fissures that exist. I'm not talking about just the arts sector. I'm talking about just society as a whole. Maria, our chair, talks about the not the reflex to just go back to the way things were, right? Once it's almost like you get sick and you get better again, and then you just go back to the way things were. And we can't do that. And I have learned so much. I feel like some of the earliest conversations I had with you, Randy, and with others in this room were like a decade ago, where we talked about seizing the moment. I feel like I've learned that there is so much work we can be doing better. And it goes to some of the earlier conversations we were having. Again, back to Cezanne's brilliant phrase of under-imagined futures have consequences. We've learned this. I mean, we have 2.5 years has taught us all of what we need to reimagine. And I think the biggest challenge we have is, how do you change? And as the lone federale here, we're the worst at changing. Federal level, state level, the local level. I mean, we have 2 former local arts agency folks here. It's tough to change within government. And I think that's, for me, maybe one of the biggest lessons learned is, how can we encourage change? Mm-hmm. I'll give a perfect example, and I'll yield to other folks, because this is, I think, something everybody wants to weigh in on. Our current tax code, this is a weighty topic, but which was probably written around the time I was born in the early 70s. The whole not-for-profit structure, is that the best structure that serves and I'm talking about the arts community, but just in general, social service, health, everything else. I mean, that's existed. I'm 52, so that's existed for 50+ years. Should we reimagine that? I mean, is the not-for-profit structure the best thing we have to support communities around the country? I think the answer is no. What would it take to reimagine that? And I'm not saying it would be easy. It might be insurmountable, but for me, those are the kind of questions we should be asking. And really, maybe it's going to take 10 years to change that, but we have to start that course. And so back to your original prompt of what we've learned, that there are a lot of things we could be doing better. And have we learned to kind of set that course to make change? And I don't know if we have.
I think something that I would like to add to that, what do we learn on our experience? We learned that we need to be ready. We learned that we need to change the way we do things. We cannot stay the same all the time. We knew the new generation, they're incredible with technology. And we knew that that time was coming. And the pandemic pushed us to move into the digital era faster than we thought that we would. And so it's something personally what I learned, that we need to change the way we do things, which it was very drastically, being a hands-on organization and to move to online classes. We had to develop, we had to create a new way of teaching and to change the way we did it. And again, because I have a good number of youngsters, teachers in the program, we were able to do it, to change. And going back to the in-person, it was a little bit much easier to come back. But that's one of the main things that we learned, that we cannot keep doing everything the same, that we have to learn new ways and to be aware that changes can happen in a flash.
Yeah.
Without notice.
I'd love to add that I think as we think about what we learn and how we can shift practice to policy and systems in really embracing community-driven approaches and asset-based approaches. And it sounds a little simple and romantic, but making sure that those who are making recommendations for policy and system change are that is relevant to the people who it's going to impact. And I understand, again, that's a lofty goal, but in the work of thinking, as I mentioned, about cultural asset mapping and identification, these are really processes that go in, that are hyper local, that go into neighborhoods and are community driven to say, this is who we are, and this is what we want, and this is how we want to use our experiences and our culture to change the systems and policies that either provide financial resources or human resources or resources in time or space. And so those kinds of community-driven approaches, I think, can really change both big policy in terms of legislative approaches, but also little p policy in terms of practice and the way that institutions are run. I want to lift up a couple examples. One in the city of Santa Monica, the 18th Street Art Center worked in partnership with the Alliance for California Traditional Arts to do an asset mapping and asset identification project that lifted up what they call ghost assets, which is just the coolest term out there, I think. but really it was designed to bring community members together in the Pico neighborhood and say, even though maybe these physical spaces aren't here, what are the memories? And yesterday, I know that Marquise talked a lot about memory and how we archive memory. This project created a beautiful website for Black stories. And that storytelling narrative and repository has actually created a Black agenda for the city of Santa Monica. So there's this really beautiful trajectory. And then I also want to lift up the work that Gulgun and her team are doing in Minneapolis to look at cultural assets in the city, but then specifically to think about how the city can change its practice, not from a legislative side of things, but really how they're thinking about resources and where money and time and space and all the big R resources are going to. And so I think, again, getting back to how policies are relevant to the people that they're going to impact is again, simply said, but an important thing that we can learn from all that we've just been through.
I love that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think the question, what has the pandemic taught us? And we were talking about, Randy, you were talking about the experience you had on the airplane with, folks that we were sending visual cues, from tattoos or what they were wearing, political statements on their clothes. But when you were stuck in an airport together, there was this common circumstance where there was a possibility of connection. And you had me thinking on that. And I thought about what, during the pandemic, those of us were involved in the creative workforce or, culture economy, we were throwing some major big league ideas out there, yourself included, people on this panel, talking about, can we reimagine the era of the work projects administration? Can we retool, the conservation corps for the reality of the information economy that we live in and creative economy that, that powers us? So there was this incredible moment where even, people that probably would think those are fringe conversations were actually thinking about how to convert these into policy realities and programs. And I was like, well, why is that? Well, because we were the common circumstance we were in actually, even though we couldn't be close and intimate with each other, somehow it brought our imaginations together. It brought our compassion together to think about really new ways of doing things. So I thought about, you talked about the importance also of us getting, I think also like you look at our foundations that are heavy hitters are largely coastal, right? The same type of philanthropy or the way it looks very differently, for example, in Texas. A lot of family foundations, a lot of, potentially some corporate money. And the arts hasn't really maybe carved a great inroads into that community, maybe with the exception of Houston in a way. But what I thought about is also that it's important that we exchange ways of ideas and doing things and keep our imaginations open, which is, I think, what the pandemic taught us. I thought about, in Texas, you have, I think, a political leadership that sometimes is very out of sync, doesn't behave like most people in Texas. I don't think, and I think sometimes folks on the coast, sometimes because of the policies that get established, associate all folks in Texas with those types of decisions, that we're just consenting to these types of things happening. It couldn't be further from the truth. It couldn't be further from the truth. And I think, I was thinking about, in Texas, in the coast, you'll see a whole neighborhood with the Black Lives Matter, science is real, poster. But will those people stop to change your tire like they do in Texas, even if they don't agree with you politically? You know what I mean? Maybe that's a romanticization, but that's the culture I see in Texas, that sometimes common circumstance will provide a space for changing tires, talking together on delayed airplanes, pandemic cooperation, barn raising, pea patch planning, and like food pantrying. These are the common projects that we want to identify, that the pandemic, like we started doing that stuff together. People that don't relate or have the same ideology, we're assembling mutual aid lists together. So I think, and what's the outcome of retaining that ability to not just be in your brand or your ideology, which I actually think there's a project across the spectrum upon us. And I think folks that really would love to inflame completely a renewed culture war. I think there's a project being imposed upon us. We have to try to resist that. Of course, keep yourself safe. I'm not telling anyone how to think or act, but that project, I think it definitely kills the imagination. Yep. And it can kill compassion if we buy into those narratives to a degree where we're not able to think creatively. And the outcomes in terms of creative process are projects like Paul Flores in the Mission District. He's an artist. He's a poet and artist. But what he did with some of the funding NALAC put forth through the Catalyst for Change project is he held dialogues with the local community, Central American, Mexican American, some monolingual speakers, about the food pantry space and how it could operate and serve in the future and incorporate some artistic programming. It probably wouldn't look at first blush as like a wildly successful artistic project, but the staying power of what was established in the relationships there is the fertile ground for creative output, meeting community needs in this dynamic way, food pantrying, and or even projects like we funded. There's a group in Puerto Rico, and I think, let me flip the name here. I just saved it. I just want to mention it, give it a shout out real quick. Bear with me, folks. They're based. I'll stop. They're based, I think, in Ponce, in Puerto Rico. But the important thing is, they're creating ceramic filters using clay in Puerto Rico with traditional practices. But the funding was to have them have dialogues, with factories how to produce these things. So again, that might be more of an economic development person's thing. But if we that have the resource are flexing and thinking differently, they're guarding a natural resource, it's creative, and they're fulfilling a community need.
Yep.
So we just have to retain that ability to not be tricked into and duped into this,
The false binary.
Yeah, the false binary. Thank you.
Mr. Orlov.
Just to add about what we learned, I feel like we've learned to disrupt muscle memory. I mean, and maybe that's not clear enough, but there's so much that we accomplished when we needed to accomplish it. And how do we continue that? I equate it to, it's a silly example, but my kids challenged me to run a half marathon, which I'm not a runner, and I trained for it a little bit. And after I finished it, I didn't do any spectacular time, but my son was like, "Why don't you just keep like training? Like, why don't you just keep in shape?" And I was like, "Oh, okay." Like, it's that disruption of like continuing it, right? And so you mentioned mutual aid societies. We got involved in a neighborhood mutual aid society in DC, and it's like, why aren't we continuing that? I mean, I'm blaming myself, but we all were able to come together in a time of need. And what have we learned? We have to disrupt our regular patterns. I want to channel a little bit of our chair, Maria Rosario Jackson, who talks about Artful Lives and talks about how society, and I think the artful life part might not frighten people, but it creates a picture that some people like don't feel like they fit into. But how, like we experience where the arts and the creative life is fitting in transportation, in social services, in healthcare, it's not that radical. It's not radical at all. It's a matter of how it's framed, and it's a matter of disrupting people's muscle memory and just a change of practice. And I think we have the ability still to do that. I hope that makes sense.
No, I think that's great. Well, and I want to give a shout out to Michael and Julie and Julie Baker, who's here with us in Denver. Those early conversations about creating a new WPA and like really reimagining the role that artists play in their community was a lifeline for me when the times were real desperate, being in the first city hit by the pandemic. And Al, I want to give you a shout out as a very liberal person who has lots of opinions and a lot of family in Texas. I appreciate, being able to see the humanity in that. And maybe I owe homeboy with the 1776 shirt who I had a drink with at the airport more than I was willing to admit when I landed in Denver. So I appreciate that. Jessica, I want to combine, so we had been having this conversation about, you were talking earlier about the roles and relationships and the way those have changed with arts and culture, creative economy, economic development. And we were thinking about that in the context of the infrastructure bill or any of the trillions of dollars of federal investment that came out of the ether over the last couple of years. Speaking of breaking muscle memory, we can apparently appropriate $1 bajillion in a totally divided Congress, which is a miracle, actually.
So much money.
But I'd love to hear a little bit about the new role in relationships that you're seeing. You brought up a couple of examples, Santa Monica and Minneapolis, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about those roles and relationships, and then we'll kick that off. We have time for like maybe one more question, and then we'll see if folks in the chat have questions. We're coming Ventry style.
And I want to know if Jessica read the 2,000-page document.
Spoiler, did not.
Jessica annotated the entire
Yes.
infrastructure bill
I am now an expert
and all of
on
its
the
rules and
infrastructure.
regulations.
So I think one thing that's important to remember for arts leaders and artists, community activists, is that traditional economic development is really about attracting large outside businesses. Offering tax incentives, getting office parks, several 100,000 square foot buildings in the suburbs outside of city centers, warehousing, data centers, trying to attract these big employers, regardless of what that does to the kind of cultural fabric or the social cohesion of a community. And with this, the infrastructure bill and as you said, the massive amount of money that's at the federal level, so much money. And the EDA, the Economic Development Administration, is flush right now. Economic development leaders don't know what to do with all of this money, just because there's so much sitting around, and there's a long on-ramp, multiple years for this money to be spent. And so I think that when I think about the role of arts and culture and leaders in the creative economy, that again, going back to that chasm, that separation, we've almost like professionalized how to be separate, how to put arts and culture in one place and put economic development and business development in another place. There's so many wonderful examples happening in rural, suburban, urban communities where folks are kind of laying that aside, and they're starting to say, we are actually stronger together than this, that phrase of being more than the sum of our parts. And so what I'm excited about is some of those conversations that are starting to happen, where I think local arts leaders have the opportunity to be a translator. A lot of organizations, Americans for the Arts included, but the NEA, other associations have resources for how to be a translator, how to walk in both with data, with the case-making tools, and the stories to say, we're not that different. And if we could just sit down and have a conversation about what our mutual goals are and what our priorities are, then we could figure out where our strengths lie and where we both have gaps. And these are the stories that I get really excited about telling and learning about across the country of chambers of commerce and local arts agency leaders coming together, and the chamber saying, well, we've got business development resources. That's what we do. We're experts at that. We have, the everybody on speed dial from, in the planning office and in the economic development, in tourism, and the local arts agency leaders saying, well, we know our arts community and we know where we can provide innovative, creative solutions. And we have all these creative entrepreneurs that don't see themselves as part of the chamber, or they don't see that they need business development skills. And so coming together, that's at the local level. At the federal level, we talked about broadband, and just $80 billion that's been set aside for broadband. I live in a rural community, and it's a happening place. There's a lot going on in Taos. We have an innovation tech kind of incubator through the University of New Mexico in Taos. That's also a Center for Rural Innovation hub. So they've gotten a lot of money. I mean, I think almost $2 million to develop tech startups. And I'm sitting here thinking, what about all the cool digital artists that probably want to live in Taos, New Mexico, or who live in the northern New Mexico region that could really benefit from business development at a tech, entrepreneurial hub? And how can we connect these two things? So I think at that broader level, there's a lot of money coming down, a lot of effort to connect rural communities, indigenous communities across the country. And I want arts and culture leaders and artists and imaginaries to be there at that table, because there's a lot there. There's a lot of opportunity there.
Thank you. Michael?
I love the word translator. I mean, the entire country is flush with cash coming from the federal level. That's not always going to be there. I mean, that's also my concern of 2 years from now, at least in my world of the state, regional, and local arts agencies, that money is going to dry up at some point, the relief money. But I love Jessica used the word translator, because I think in so many cases, money, we talked about it sitting in a dark, cold basement and nobody can find it. And part of it is people aren't talking. And we need to encourage as many folks to be in conversation with each other. I have benefited from some of the most incredible conversations over the past 2 years with ARPA money. State arts agencies, regional arts organizations, local arts agencies who are subgranting our money are constantly challenging me. Can we do this with the money? And I'm like, that's a good question. Let me check in on that. And 9 times out of 10, we've been able to figure out a way where the money could be used differently. And so it's back to the muscle memory, and it's trying to figure out ways of translating so everybody knows that this capital exists and it could be used for so many different purposes. It's a really golden opportunity. I have not read through even 10 pages of the infrastructure bill, but it's incredibly exciting because it has a shelf life, perhaps a decade or more. So it's something we should all be, raising up and encouraging at the local level that folks are asking those questions now.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I'm gonna quote my good friend Javier Torres Campos from the Cerna Foundation. He talks a lot about, see the code behind the design. And I was thinking about how there's codes at play from the dollars at the highest federal level and how those dollars go to municipalities, and then how those municipalities get those dollars into nonprofit hands or private businesses. And I started thinking of a tale of two. I was thinking, of all things, Randy, Massive Monkeys from Seattle.
Yeah.
And so Massive Monkeys is an internationally renowned group of breakdancers, but they're way more than that in Seattle. They're like a community unto themselves, and an intergenerational community of artists, no less. They have Massive Monkeys, and over time they mentored world-class breakdancers who became the Vicious Puppies. I don't know the third generation, but I was thinking about how, they had this moment in the sun where they were on national television, and after that, they just catapulted into these. They always had institutional relationships. They were breakdancers at a cultural center that Randy and I worked at, and we saw them develop. They were always world-class, but they sort of parlayed that exposure and the institutional community-based relationships they had with people that probably knew how to help them finance, the dojo and the ID, right? Or how to, put a budget together so that they can continue this intergenerational cultural practice. I was just in San Diego with a relative, and he was telling me about his son, who's 25 and has been breakdancing for 15 years, and he's driving a Lyft and working gigs, and they're world-class competitors, yet they don't. I was talking to him about grants and stuff, and he was like, "What are you talking about?" And so I was like, "Oh, there's kind of this interesting divide between artists that are hustlers and grinders and just make stuff happen, sometimes at their own peril, and they have no retirement. They have, but they do it all for the love of the practice and the love of community in some cases. And that crew also has, a second generation going. And so what's the difference? Relationships or institutional relationships that are either they have or they've initiated, or that are looking out for them.
Yeah.
And I think that, so then if we think about that, there's like maybe a literacy moment that's necessary for folks that have resources at the federal level, the banking community, and maybe community CDFIs, community development finance institutions. I know that there's been movement in the past. Like I think I was reading up on some CERNA funding in this, but I don't know where the traction is. And maybe it's just an opportunity for a literacy moment, so that the artists who are the hustlers and everything might have an entree into getting properly capitalized, and also being looked out for with the institutional support, right? I think that's the vast majority of some of the creative economy. Yep. They're making it work.
I totally agree. I'll offer a thought, and Cameron, if you wanna come up and prep the eventuary, I think we're at the questions from the interwebs, and we'll see what folks bring. I just wanted to offer that even before the pandemic, when trillions of dollars appeared and were distributed through a variety of channels, I had the good fortune to live in the city of Seattle, which in 2019, when we sought to create a more inclusive creative economy in one of the most successful technology cities in the world, I came to this realization that we had, I think, about 15 Fortune 500 companies. We had several of the wealthiest people in the world. We had companies that invented air travel and desktop computing and cloud computing and $10 coffee drinks. We've changed.
You say that with pride.
We've changed the music industry a number of times. We have several private space exploration companies. The largest endowment on Earth is at the Gates Foundation, about 600 feet from the Space Needle. The second largest endowment on Earth is about a mile and a half down the street in what will be the Paul G. Allen Family Foundation. Resources have never been the problem.
Oh.
There never was a shortage of resources. There hasn't been, and there isn't now. The shortage is imagination. The shortage is in what is that compelling future, that different future that we want to create, that can, why would we need to colonize Mars when we have enough money to fix our problems on the ground right now in our communities?
I want to not push back. I agree with everything you said. I thought when you said $10 cup of coffee, you were going to hold something up, but imagination, but a shared imagination.
Yes. Yeah.
And the
Collective
ability to collaborate and work together. We said earlier, policy you can't say policy in politics, without saying the word politics. Yep. And so we have so much potential. Part of it is we can't figure out how to sit in an airport with 3 people who have different opinions and just get along and talk.
No, it's,
Well,
it's,
that-
I
that-
think
that's
that's
the
what,
the problem.
right. The resources weren't the issue, but how we get there together, how we agree on that North Star and a collective impact frame is is the challenge of right now.
Or collectively disagree on things, but figure out ways to push forward agendas that benefits everybody.
Yes.
That's,
Yeah, totally agree. To the internet. Cameron?
Awesome. Thank you, Randy. My name is Cameron Green. I am the executive coordinator at Westaff. I use he, him pronouns, and I am a Southeast Asian man with black hair, brown skin, and a blue button-down shirt. At this time, I'd like to invite people on Aventry to submit their questions in the chat, and we'll get to as many as I can. And while we wait for those questions to come in, I just want to thank Randy, Salvador, Alberto, Jessica, and Michael for their thought leadership and partnership in thinking about how we can shift this hegemonic paradigm from a white-centric, risk-averting future to a more to a future that's imagined more radically. So we do have a question from the Aventry space. And I also want to thank the people on Aventry for the robust conversation. It's been amazing just to kind of see it all come through. You guys are really great. So we have a question from Danielle Brazil.
Hey.
Government alone cannot meet the needs of people in communities. Our NGO structure is crucial, but we need new types of partnership models as well. How are members of the panel expanding partnerships with CDFIs and other types of community investment initiatives to drive community cultural resources?
Danielle, you're the best. I'm going to ask Alberto to answer that first because you've been talking about CDFIs for months.
Yeah, I think for art service organizations, it's somewhat new territory. I think I think I have to give a nod to I think there's First People's Fund, folks like Indian Collective, and I think the other name is escaping me. But when I read up on these models, it seems like they're exercising their sovereignty, but they're doing it in super creative ways so that culture is produced, but housing is also in that conversation, how to produce housing at reservations at scale. Challenge, and at the same, not being afraid to talk about land back and actually respecting the treaties, right? What's more patriotic than respecting treaties? So, I think you can look, to indigenous communities if you want to see strong examples of people that are not buying into false binaries that say, oh, this is deep community economic development finance. This is cultural work. This is philanthropic work. I think some of those organizations are really blurring the lines. I know there's a lot of hope and interest in terms of the arts service organizations and like the Ely partnership and looking into those opportunities.
I do think you've also seen an explosion in the role of intermediaries. I think Westaff is doing pretty heroic work in this space. I think CCI in California, not Alihi Fund in Washington. I mean, there's a lot. Danielle is absolutely correct that government has moved fast and is still struggling to keep up because it is designed to move slowly. And so who are the Salvadors of the world that can stand between the community need and the funder or the government that can be responsive, that can have the trusted relationships in community, and also the nimbleness to deploy sort of new models and new resources.
Right.
And I thank you for the question, Danielle. I delighted to hear it. The nimbleness is really crucial, and government and nimble usually doesn't go hand in hand. We mentioned mutual aid societies earlier, and I was just amazed, not just in DC, but reading about what was happening all over. It's also we talked about translators, people who understand their community better than we do, and the ability to shift power into the hands of folks that are truly on the ground. And it's not taking power away from others. It's a shared power. It's a shared responsibility. And I think you'd be surprised at how, I got emotional just thinking about it, of how much work just neighbors within a particular small community were able to do with no resources to care for their community. Imagine if they were given actual resources. So I think to answer Danielle's question, which I wholeheartedly agree with, it's a sharing power, sharing resources, and working, again, more collaboratively to
Yeah.
respond to all the needs of particular communities.
May I respond? So just really, I'll try to be brief as possible. But
okay.
I think that I referred to like a literacy moment earlier, and I think what that would be a generous, I think, action on behalf of foundations or some from. I'm not so egocentric to think that even though we fund arts all over the country and reach everywhere, there's CDFIs that have been in the same community in the same place for 30 years. They probably know a little bit about who's there and what their needs are, artists included. Do they know? Maybe they don't. Maybe, and there's a lot of assumptions. Like maybe we could name our assumptions and see, maybe you are funding artists and I just don't know, So I think maybe a literacy moment and having some forum in that space could advance us, and maybe we could maybe prototype together and not overrush things, but sort of prototype what's possible, see what's being done, and think about how to achieve it at scale. Whether it's like, embedding a space ownership program within our arts intermediary or art service organization, or embedding artists to work with the CDFI in some sort of creative engagement process or something, right? There's some room to play, I believe.
I think that to be able to partnership, to collaborate, the most important thing is to communicate with higher leaders, with higher educational organizations that are in the community, to let them know, they see the need that is in the community. And if there's no communication, we're in the process of partnership with the college on our city, because we see the need. We're in the process of hopefully next year, where we will be creating workshops and try to get dual credit activities in our program, not only being an arts organization, but moving up with the needs that are in our community. So communication is the most important thing, to be able for everybody that is in the community to understand we need to focus mainly on the need and not being selfish on my organization is first and I want to do what is mine. No, we need to all think together and see what we can do together. Who doesn't have what? I have this, you have that. Let's put it together and let's focus on the final outcome.
Well said.
I'll add, and thanks, Danielle, for the question. I know there's going to be a session tomorrow on the solidarity economy from the folks at Art.coop and Open Collective, but I'll just pre-lift them up, because I think that the folks that are out there that are imagining new systems of ownership and finance are really changing the landscape. The East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, Seed Commons, which is focusing on non-extractive finance. These are really paradigm shifting kinds of ways of bringing decision making and power back into the community. And so I think those are some really important examples. And I'll just, again, kind of lift up the role of the intermediary, as others have done, and especially in my world of local arts agencies, that local arts agencies also need the skills to be able to understand how to support those kinds of economic and business models so that they can thrive, so that we can look beyond the nonprofit sector, not abandon it, of course, but to say there are a lot of other ways of doing work and a lot of other ways of distributing resources. And I also want to say, I think that I know I brought up the idea of being a translator and kind of the language around this, but I also, on the flip side, think that we can sometimes get bogged down in the language. And I'm inspired right now by a colleague, Kelsey McCrary in Monroe, Louisiana, who talks about doing the good work, which is really that she believes that community and people know what they want and they know what they need, and they might not have the language. They might not say, we need to do cultural asset mapping to understand what's in our community, but they know that they want to identify and preserve and lift up the things that make them special. And so one of the things I think that we can do as leaders and as local leaders is to create space for that and to hold space for that. That gets a little bit away from how does finance, how does finance work and the role of government, but also Kelsey works with the city, and so she is so much creating that container, that safe container for people to say this is what matters.
De-jargonification.
Yes,
That's
yes,
good.
thank
It's good. I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah, we have time for one more, and I'd like to invite anyone from our in-person audience to come up and ask a question.
No pressure, guys. Yeah. Do it, Karen.
Hi, thank you for taking my question, and I'm Karen Helmerson. And I just do want to say, thank you to West staff. This has just been fantastic. I really love everything that you've all been talking about. And my question actually stems from it was something that Michael said, and I just really, my mind is like stuck on this now, and I really love it. It's really it's simple question, but not necessarily simple to answer. And then Jessica, you were just beginning to refer to it before I came up, but it's this idea, is the NPO structure really the best structure through which to work? I just think that is such a key question. Having worked with a lot of nonprofits throughout my life, and then Randy was saying, as others have also mentioned, the money is out there. The money's there. And so I'm, in my mind, connecting this because historically, traditionally, and that's again another phrase you brought up, which I love, disrupting muscle memory, because I'm actually struggling with muscle memory right now, just like changing that habit of mind. But that has been the way we normally approach resources, capital and/or otherwise, largely in our creative communities, is through the NPO structure. So I'm not asking you to come up with a brand new structure in the moment, but if you could just talk a little bit more about that, because I just find that really fascinating. Thanks.
Maybe I shouldn't have mentioned that. I've given a lot of thought to this since starting at the National Endowment for the Arts. Before that, I worked at the local level for the city of Chicago. And so it was my first foray into the grant making world. On paper, it seems like a wonderful idea. You're obligated to create a board and manage, but I think a lot of people don't look at the burden it places, especially on small, under-resourced communities and organizations around the country. I've never been an executive director of a not-for-profit. I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of not-for-profits, and it's burden maybe isn't the right word, because there's a flip side to it, right? You put together a great board and they can help move along so many of the resources that are needed. But I ask that question all the time. I'll give one just short example. I think everybody on the panel here could respond to that. About 8 years ago, I was at the NASA National Assembly of State Arts Agencies conference, not the space conference, which was in DC. And I sat down with a couple colleagues from Puerto Rico. And I said, I was looking at our grants to Puerto Rico this past year, and we gave one grant. There were 3 grants applied for to the NEA from Puerto Rico. And I'm like, I know the creative community in Puerto Rico is massive. That can't, it can't be that there's only 3 organizations applying. And the 2 immediate responses were language, right? Everything is in English, which we've changed. And I give a lot of credit to our new chair and the new team who have come in and said, addressing that. But the other was the not-for-profit structure. It doesn't really exist much in Puerto Rico. I'm not to say that it doesn't, but so many arts organizations, arts collectives are not-for-profits. Mm-hmm. And so it's easy to use muscle memory and say, well, file for a 501c3 and get your paperwork. Or should we be saying, maybe we need to change? Maybe we need to come up with a new system. Again, seems like an insurmountable task, but if the last time we've updated that piece of our legislation was 1970, I think, maybe it's time to actually look at how we serve. Again, this is not just the arts, community. This is in healthcare. This is across all sectors. So I don't have an answer. I'm willing to be on a Tiger team and to start thinking about it.
I mean, probably too early to call it, but I will say that's the hottest take that's going to come from this panel is the reimagination of the entire nonprofit structure.
Yeah.
Also,
we could have a day-
Co-sign, agree, and we can be on the task force. It'll be great.
we could have a whole conference on the nonprofit industrial complex.
Truly. It's not. The question was, is it the best? So for me, it's not. It's an easy answer. No. So because, and I mean that as someone who's like, that's been my life. I graduated public administration degree. I'm highly invested in the merit and the merit and the evolution of the nonprofit structure. That said, it's not that old. It's not that old. Like any structure, it kind of it's like an organism that protects itself from change, even when it's really necessary. From outside influence that could be beneficial. So I think the answer for me is no, because diversity and reciprocity are laws of nature. So, we as human beings, and I think in organizations, we're just kind of variations on a theme of replicating, in some ways, natural process. So no, the answer is no. Like I think
Wait, what's your answer?
Yeah. Sorry, but there's many ways to learn. So that's not to throw it under the bus. But there's maybe some upgrading and some 2.0, 3.0 things that are necessary, and it is going to benefit everybody. It seems like folks in finance, not only do they know this, they can capitalize on it and prey upon it, right? Like in terms of diversifying strategies. So I think whether it's collectives, fiscal sponsorships, nonprofit status, or just it's our responsibility to be nimble, because our job is not to be a nonprofit organization, it's to meet our missions.
Well, and to offer a cautionary tale.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know that it's at this point, but the Kodak Eastman Film Company, once upon a time, made lots of film, physical film that you process at a lab, that you took pictures on with your camera, and then digital photography began to emerge. And people went to their board of directors and said, digital is happening. We should invest in digital. And they said, we make film. And they don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
So I think things that don't evolve, that don't adapt in nature, in systems, tend to eventually find their conclusion one way or the other. We can either evolve or go away. But, I think that tends to be what happens, at least in the natural world and in the business world. There's probably a point at which that could come for the nonprofit world. Yes.
I'll add, I would agree that is it the best? Maybe not. It's one structure.
One way to do it.
It's one structure. I think these other business models, the cooperatives, the collectives, what I'm inspired by is the way that both in business and nonprofit, these organizations are infiltrating within the systems and changing them. Again, going back to East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, the way that entity is filed with the Security Exchange Commission to be able to trade shares differently. That is incredible, right? That's complicated, that's hard, but that's going within the system and changing it from within. I think one thing that that nonprofits have really taken to heart is this subservience, like the notion of we're the third sector, and saying, oh, can you please give us a handout and we'll take whatever money we can get. But as artists, as arts organizations, as agencies, let's own our power, right? And let's say, okay, we're within this nonprofit legal structure, but we can operate in tandem as equal, respected, trusted partners alongside business, alongside economic developers, alongside political leaders, and own our space and walk in that space. And that's a very different way of being in the world as an institution than saying, well, we don't have resources, we have the scarcity mindset. Please give us anything you can. Please give us your scraps, and we'll make whatever we can do with that. We don't need that anymore. So that's a place of imagination, but we can just manifest that.
That is a great place, I think, to leave the conversation. I will say prioritize rest, advance change, cultivate imagination, Amplify Joy. Thank you to the panel. Thank you on Eventry. Thank you to West staff. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.